You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and federally certified veteran-owned small business. I'm your host, Robert Bain, along with our producer, Chris Spangle. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact us at chris@leadersandlegends.net. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified veteran-owned small business. I was in the Army, fortunately, from 1987 to 1990, and it was before this time that I got to see on television our very special guest today. He is Chris Matthews. He's written tons of books. He has been in the room more times than I can count. And you've seen him on television over and over, famously the host of Hardball. Mr. Matthews, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you, Robert. I'm glad to be here.
We are discussing his new book, Lessons from Bobby, 10 Reasons Robert F. Kennedy Still Matters. Mr. Matthews, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really enjoyed your book. I am fortunate enough to have talked to someone I want to mention later, and that's Mike Riley. Mike Riley was a guest on my podcast, and Mike Riley was Robert F. Kennedy's campaign manager in Indiana in the spring of '68.
Wow.
And some of the questions I asked him, he's departed now, wonderful man, was what drew him to Robert Kennedy in '68? Because he had options, including just sit the hell out. What it draws you to Robert Kennedy throughout your career and your literary efforts?
I think it was his brother, Jack. My first biography of Kennedy was Nixon and Kennedy and Nixon. I did in '88, which I think explored their relationship going back to their first debate in 1947 when they went out to Western Pennsylvania and took the train back and flipped through the top and bottom bunks. And it was an amazingly intimate relationship in a political sense. And then I wrote a book on Jack Kennedy, Elusive Hero, because I think he is elusive. I wrote about Bobby because I was very much emotionally involved in the '68 campaign, rooting for Gene McCarthy in the beginning. He got in November of '67. Bobby didn't get in till the day before St. Patrick's Day in March of '68. That distance made a huge difference in that election. It gave Gene McCarthy the high ground with all the college kids, the intellectuals, if you will, the Jewish kids, I suppose. He just did have that advantage over them. And
Were you clean for Gene?
I was already clean, so I didn't. I was at grad school in North Carolina, and I went to the March on the Pentagon in '67, and with Norman Mailer, which he made that whole event famous. And then I ended up praying for Bobby because I thought that Bobby was the only one that could win the nomination. That it was really tough against Hubert Humphrey, and it was going to be tough. No matter what happened, he would have a hard time, even though he won California. He still would have had a hard time in New York. New York was tough. New York was very Gene McCarthy oriented because of Stevenson, I think, Adlai Stevenson. And then the whole convention was going to be a challenge. There weren't enough primaries for him to convincingly win the nomination on his own. But he was going to contest it, and everything was going to be different in the world if he had won, if he had survived, because if he had gone to Chicago at the convention, it would have been a totally different political reality. It would have been Bobby against Humphrey. It would have been heroic. It wouldn't have been about students fighting the cops and cops fighting the students. It wouldn't be like that. It would be so much more optimistic about our country and where we were headed. But the more I wrote and researched Bobby, I realized how much he did as Attorney General in terms of so much the civil rights, fighting Jim Crow at Ole Miss and University of Alabama and in Birmingham, and pushing his brother to give the famous June '63 civil rights speech, which are extraordinary events, and all that he did in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it would have been impossible to imagine that whole event turning out how positively it did, had it not been for Bobby. And of course, Bobby got Jack elected in '52 against Henry Cabot Lodge to the United States Senate, and then ran the big election campaign in '60. There wouldn't have been a Jack Kennedy without Bobby. Absolutely. I mean, his role was so critical. And so I wanted to write about him because what I learned about him, and of course, going after the mob and the rackets committee, these horrible people, that frightening characters that almost like Johnny Friendly and on the waterfront. They weren't like the Godfather. They were noticeably and horribly who they were. They were terrible people. And of course, the McCarthy thing, I'm complicated about. I grew up in a family which was, my mom was very McCarthy. My dad said he went too far. My dad was sort of where most Americans were with him. But not only did he not go too far, he never caught any Reds. He didn't do what he was doing. He didn't accomplish even what Nixon did. What Nixon did, of course, with Alger Hiss, he didn't accomplish his goal of catching Reds, of communists in the government. He found a dentist of some court in New Jersey.
That's right.
Who promoted him or who promoted the general? And it was all this craziness of drunken McCarthy. He was drunk all the time. And Bobby said that he was drunk right to his death. And you can actually see him in the pictures. One of the pictures I put in the book on Bobby Kennedy, Raging Spirit, you see McCarthy as the hungover man he was. I mean, drunks show themselves the next day. They don't hide it. They get dressed up, they put ties on, they comb their hair, but drunks look like drunks. And you can tell who you're dealing with here. And Joe McCarthy was a drunk.
One of the things about the '68 campaign, I'm lucky enough to have interviewed Mark Lawrence, Mark Updegrove, Brian Vandemark, all these phenomenal '60s historians on the podcast. They love educating me. My graduate degree's in medieval history, so they're always like, why are you reading about this now? Shouldn't you be reading about Lancelot or whomever? But one of the things about
the guy at Harvard.
Yeah, they're the ones who did the Updegrove, I think, just wrote the latest biography of JFK.
It's really good.
It is very good. He's a wonderful, very gracious intellect.
Yeah, well, he's going to do another one later. I think he's going to follow up on that one.
Oh, really?
No, is Updegrove the Harvard professor? I don't think it is.
No, he runs the institute down in Texas.
No, this is the guy at Harvard. I read the Harvard one. I didn't read the other one.
Well, Dalek has an unfinished life.
He's very good on the health of Jack. He really had that story no better than anyone else about what his real condition was, Jack.
And how he hit it. Absolutely.
Yeah.
In the '68 campaign, one of the things that comes through in all the books I've ever read, my favorite actually is Jules Witcover, The Year the Dream Died, about Robert Kennedy being upset with himself that he wasn't challenged. He didn't challenge Johnson first. Is that a fair comment that he was always kind of haunted by that?
I think there's a guy at the Globe thought the same thing, and that gnawed at him. It just bothered him. And Roger Mudd asked him I remember watching this. Roger Mudd of CBS got him in an airport waiting room. And he said, "What does it bother you that the A students aren't with you? The first kids to join." And he said, "Yeah." He lost them, and he never really got them back. He didn't get them back in Oregon. Clearly, that's why he lost that primary. And he knew it was because he hadn't gotten into the race fast enough. And Jack Kennedy had written, Jack Kennedy, I read the beginnings of Jack's memoir. This is when he was President Kennedy. And he wrote about how he always believed in starting early in a campaign. And his argument was based on what was it? Coca-Cola. He said, "Why do you think Coca-Cola gets advertised all the time?" He said, "Everybody knows there's Coca-Cola. You don't have to introduce the product. Everybody knows what it tastes like, and they like it, or they like Pepsi or whatever." He said, "They do. The reason they have to do it, they have to keep reminding people." And Kennedy's argument was that most people spend their lives not thinking about politics.
Yeah.
Of course, this is before the age of Trump, but you can actually escape from politics. If you weren't interested in it, you didn't get involved in it. Today, it's in your face almost every hour, but you could skip it. Go spend like people who follow sports and who are watching ESPN all the time. They're not focusing on politics. They're into sports. And Kenny said you got to keep reminding them because otherwise they'll forget about you.
And is that something that you think in your studies and your writing that Robert Kennedy did well? It seems to me he started out working so hard.
Yeah, I think his campaign effort in 52. Now, the problem in 52 was that most people identified the Democratic Party as a bunch of bums. They were the James what's his name in Boston. Just some clever, witty, somewhat intellectual Irishman would convince everybody to vote Democratic, but it was only in Boston, and so he went out and Kenny O'Donnell did this. Went out in the campaign and found that when he campaigned into those suburban areas and urban areas or ex-urban areas where there were some graduates of BC law or Harvard law or whatever who'd want to go out to get away from the big city, get away from Boston, and because he said that's where you have to get the difference. And so he didn't just campaign, like the governor did at the time, just the usual Democratic vote, the Irish, Italian, whatever vote. They didn't just settle for the usual Democratic vote. He went out and got the lace curtain types who had done better in life, had gotten good educations, and were tired of the old fart stuff. They didn't like those people. They were embarrassed by them. And the crookedness of them, some of them. And that's what really the brilliance of that campaign was, to go out and have all those teas for the bring in the Irish out in the burbs and to bring them into the campaign and make them proud of the fact that they had a waspy kind of Irish guy running who acted like a wasp and didn't embarrass them. I think Kennedy's great strength was he didn't embarrass the Irish. So true.
In 1968, you mentioned just a few minutes ago, Robert Kennedy enters the race for president on March 16th. Shortly thereafter, he comes to Indiana.
Yeah.
And he is at Notre Dame and gives a speech there. One of my former podcast guests, whose name is Michael Browning, is a very successful entrepreneur here in Indiana. He was a student at Notre Dame, and he was tasked by the campaign to find a car for Bobby to ride in South Bend and in Notre Dame. He finally found a car. The Kennedys rode in it. But when he went to get the car, it was so beaten up and scratched from people trying to get just a touch of Bobby Kennedy. He didn't think the dealership would take it back, but they did.
Wow.
That's one of my favorite stories on the 350 interviews I've done. And it's my...
That's April 4th. That's April 4th.
Yeah. And that's...
King was
right.
King was shot.
And I lived a block from where the speech was given in Kennedy King Park. But that's a long way of introducing. It's hard for us, maybe the Obama campaign in 8, to remember or to think how incredibly popular and the enthusiasm and the fervor that was generated by Robert Kennedy. He stopped wearing cufflinks because he just kept getting them torn off. Another one of my favorite stories.
You believe the shoes he lost? How do you
Yeah.
take shoes off a Kennedy? They carry somewhere.
Talk about that idealistic energy that was certainly there.
A couple of things. First of all, the physicality of it, because we were talking about how he had lost the smarter kids, the more intellectually aggressive kids who went to work for McCarthy. So he had to spend his time physically connecting with voters, poor people, black voters, brown voters, Hispanics in California. He had to campaign very physically. So he would ride around in open cars. I mean, nobody's going to do this anymore. I mean, he was physically, he said, I let them touch me because he said, if they don't touch me, it won't really connect because hearing it from a politician is not good enough anymore. You got to touch him. So he was letting people touch him, grab his clothes, his shoes, his cufflinks. It was extraordinarily dangerous. And he ended up, as someone, Jack Newfield, the columnist from New York, said, he spent his life with financiers and celebrities and astronauts and mountain climbers, and he ended up reaching for the hand of a $75 a week Mexican American dishwasher. That's how he died. And people like Arthur Schlesinger, the great historian, said he must have known that that's how his life was going to end. How he knew that what the conclusion of his life was going to look like. And, when he said, "Is everybody else okay?" He was just drawn to that physicality and danger. And I guess he thought that when he was in those crowds of African Americans in LA and going through these streets in very close conduct, that he was really communicating himself. And he was himself physically threatened. And Ethel, his wife, would talk about how many threats they were getting at the end from all sources, right wingers, basic conservatives, people who felt threatened by him. Nixon felt threatened by him. Mm-hmm. And Nixon said something. I dug this up for one of the books. He was in a hotel in Oregon when he heard that Kennedy had announced. And he said, this is going to cause such danger. He could feel how the electricity of the Kennedys was going to explode. And he was right.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies. Our guest today, New York Times bestselling author and TV star, Chris Matthews. We are discussing his book, Lessons from Bobby, 10 Reasons Robert F. Kennedy Still Matters. November 2025 was the 100th anniversary of Robert Kennedy's birth. You mentioned death threats and the people who were sending them. Other than Martin Luther King, is there another public official, who was more important to the civil rights movement than Robert Kennedy?
Well, Jack, I think that's the reason that African Americans have honored so many pictures of the three of them together. I think they were seen as public officials who worked on the inside while Martin Luther King worked on the outside in the 60s to dramatize the need for civil rights. And I think probably no white guy, I guess you can say, although that's a very broad definition, Bobby could identify with the suffering of the underdog. And he saw how the whites were so angry down in Mississippi, in Oxford, Mississippi, when he integrated that university, Ole Miss. He saw the anger that the white crowds, you think of blacks involved with protests, but the white protests were horrific in those days. People came out in a way they were so unembarrassed to do it in the Deep South, unembarrassed to be seen as in a screeching line of people yelling at a gentleman like James Meredith. People, they really looked like the bad guys. And they weren't embarrassed to do it. They were spitting on people in lunch counters. It's hard to imagine a woman a grown-up woman walking up to some guy sitting in a protest on a lunch counter and spitting on them in public with a camera on them. I think we are past that, but it was so gross. And I think he saw, he talked about walking in the shoes of the sufferers and what that would be like, and why even a kid who would say, I'm going to pull out a gun if they try to recruit me to the war in Vietnam, to draft me. He said, if I were walking in his shoes, I'd probably end up the same way. So he would find his way through experience with people to find his way into the souls of people who were under the pressure of society.
We celebrate everyone, but especially our elected officials, our presidents, who are seen as eloquent or terrific speakers. John F. Kennedy obviously being one of them, Ronald Reagan another. How good?
But Tip O'Neill said, Mister, I was standing next to Tip, my boss. We're watching Reagan deliver the Challenger speech right after the Challenger crash, when the shuttle went down and all those people were killed in a week.
I was a senior in high school, in case it bothered you.
If you were a little lower grade, you would have been in the classroom watching it on television. So a lot of kids watched it on television.
That's right.
And he was obviously, he was getting emotional about it. He said in his book that Reagan was the greatest orator he had heard in his lifetime. And then he put in, as long as he had a prepared speech. I mean, he wasn't gonna give him a full applause there, knock in there. But he did the next morning after that Challenger speech, and maybe I gave him the name, I don't know. But he called up Peggy Noonan,
Yeah.
congratulated her for the speech. No, he had his own attitudes about things. He wasn't a cartoon guy or Irish politician. He really did think through things and said things that amazed me sometimes, that showed a thinking mind was at work there.
Well, I just got finished reading Ken Kachigian's new book, Behind Closed Doors. It's superb. He's coming on the podcast next week.
You got the Armenian guys. There's a couple.
What I was asking is that how good it seemed that Bobby Kennedy was a good speaker, maybe not up to par with his brother, but in the biographies I've read of him, he was an exceptional listener. How good of a listener was Bobby Kennedy?
Well, when he spoke at in Indianapolis, in the Brooklyn neighborhood, the black neighborhood, tough neighborhood, where he went in that night, the king was killed, and he gave that. I thought it was awkward at the time. He'd repeat himself a number of times, and we don't need this, we don't need that, we don't have violence. And he said, my brother was killed by a white guy. I always thought that was awkward, but because if a white guy kills a white guy, it's not a racial or tribal issue. It's just a killing. But I think he was trying to identify with the suffering of that audience who he had just informed that Dr. King had been killed. They didn't know it.
That's right.
Cell phones in those days. But I think he was trying to say, I've been through something like the horror you're going through now. And he really was. I mean, his whole life was built on Jack Kennedy and serving him and helping him. And that's what his life mission was Jack. And I remember him in a room in the Lincoln bedroom the night that Jack was killed. And Chuck Spaulding, Jack's good friend, overheard him in the room crying as he was praying. He was saying, well, God, how can you make this happen? Why'd you do this? Why would this, we're going so well. Why did you let this happen? He was wrestling in prayer. It was something else. And Spaulding, who I got to know a little bit, I interviewed him, but it was something else to try to describe Bobby's condition in all the many months that came after Dallas. They were something else.
I hate to keep my running promo going, but I was very fortunate a few years ago to interview Clint Hill.
Yeah.
For the podcast. Rest in peace. A terrific patriot, wonderful man, and a phenomenal interview. And I asked him about that because he took a call from Robert Kennedy on that day. And I asked him, of all the things you had to deal with that day. And he said that was at the very top. When Bobby Kennedy asked Clint Hill, how bad is it? And Hill replied, it's as bad as it can get. He said, I could barely get the words out.
Wow. Well, one of my favorite movies is In the Line of Fire.
Yes, speaking of two Clints, Mr. Hill and Mr. Eastwood, exactly. How did Ted Kennedy help Robert Kennedy overcome the loss?
In the Warren Commission, which will bother some people because I've done enough writing about this to know that anything that smacks of establishment thinking bothers many people, some people at least.
Are you're gonna laugh at me? You're gonna laugh at me, Mr. Matthews, but I'm gonna tell you, I've had Gerald Posner on my podcast.
I'm with Posner. He's got a lot of nerve. He's got guts. Posner.
He does have some stones, doesn't he?
I'm with him because I think that all the evidence suggests Lee Harvey Oswald, and there's no real evidence actually saying somebody else. And you can always find problems in any case. There's something there maybe to bring them up. But Rob Reiner, for example, get him on your show because Totally. He doesn't even think that Harvey Oswald had anything to do with it. Not even he didn't even fire a shot. It wasn't him because I asked him. I'll let him speak for himself. But I said, if this was a plot, how did they get Lee Harvey Oswald to the book depository a day or two before the parade route was laid out? Because he was there 6 weeks before. So how'd that happen? This was the question Jerry Bruno posed, who was heading advance for Kennedy. He wrote a book pretty soon after the assassination and said, I don't believe any of these theories because I'm telling you, we didn't have the parade route until right before we went on it. And somehow this guy got the job and the rifle all ahead of time. It was a crime of opportunity. Nobody wants to hear it, but it was a crime. My belief is a crime of opportunity. He went after Edwin Walker. He went after Nixon.
That's right.
Point of view. People don't like it because it's on the left. If it was on the right, they would have said, perfect information. That's all we need. It's everybody wants a theory that backs up their theory. Okay. That's the way all these conspiracies. And you ask one person, by the way, just to rub it in. If you say to them, who shot Kennedy? They'll say, okay, what about the other Kennedy? Well, I don't know about that one. Of course, they want to constantly investigate because why would you want to have a Christian Palestinian kill Kennedy? Because he's pro-Israel. He's pro-Israel. How boring. He's pro-Israel. That is a reason to accept what happened, though. Because if you talk to Gene McCarthy about it, he would say that's what happened because he was accusing McCarthy in the debate of not supporting the F-15. See, and McCarthy said we were already giving Israel everything he was talking about, but are doing it under the table. And, things work out the way they do.
Well, it's very interesting. Posner says on the podcast that and we're a bit far afield, but going back to it, that if Oswald's wife had taken him back, it would have changed everything. That when he tried to get back with Marina Oswald and she said, no, we're completely and totally done. That was like a day or two before the assassination. And the other great story is, and I'm sure you know this, or you've talked to him about it, is Lee Harvey Oswald running into former PBS anchor Robert McNeil. Literally ran into him coming out of the depository. McNeil talks about it on YouTube.
And Dan Rather reporting from Dallas.
Yeah, that's right. Let me ask you about the Kennedy family a little bit. You mentioned just a few minutes ago, Bobby lived, so to speak, to help his brother in all his endeavors. How much of this sense of loyalty, sense of working together, including the Kennedy daughters, Kathleen had been killed in a plane crash. Rosemary had been lobotomized and exiled to the Midwest. But the remaining family, how much of all this Kennedy political activity was a family affair?
Well, clearly I interviewed Jean, who was the last living member, and she was delighted. They had fun. Politics was, for the women members of that family, the siblings, it was fun. You're going around to parties socially, meeting with 20 or 30 people, showing some movies of Jack or Meet the Press or whatever. And it was a social event. And it wasn't negative about all this stuff. It was all positive. And they were proud of their brother as a war hero. And of course, it is a family built on heroism, from Joe Jr. to Jack to Bobby, who went into service, and all those people killed in the line of duty, if you will. And very proud of that. Very proud of it. And Joe, I don't think Joe Kennedy could have ever figured his family was going to be built like that. He probably couldn't believe his sons were joining the military in World War II, but they did. And they were like George Bush, the president. They just joined at their young age and got into the service and took difficult, impossible missions. Joe Kennedy's mission, which was to fly a plane, and at the last minute, jump out of the plane before it dropped. The plane crashed into the V2 sites. I mean, that was the trickiest thing in the world to imagine getting through it. If you had bailed out and got picked up at sea right off the Nazi-controlled shore, how did that happen? If he had succeeded, it would be a mystery. And he got killed because the thing blew up in the air.
Yeah, and he volunteered for it.
Yeah, and because it was after his last required mission, he may have done it to compete with Jack. That's one theory I sort of worked on in one of my books.
Well, reading biographies of John F. Kennedy, you get a terrific sense of how heroic he was when the Amaguri split his PT 109, I believe, in half. Like, it's heroic regardless, but the more you read about it, you're like, why doesn't this guy have a Navy Cross or a Medal of Honor? I mean, what he kept doing and how he risked his own life.
He lost a couple crewmen, and it hurt him. Obviously, he was captain. When that ship cut him in half, he saw that the part of the boat that he's floating on looked like it was going to capsize in the middle of the night at 2 a.m, and he wanted to get the kids off the boat, the crew off the boat. So they got it. They jumped in the water, and they got a long plank. The guys who could, a lot of guys couldn't swim. It's hard to believe the Navy allows this, but there's a lot of guys that can't swim. And I got to tell you, you can't swim out in the South Pacific with the Japanese water all around it. So he's making sure that the non-swimmers are protected by the swimmers, and they all hang on this piece of wood that's floating around. And then he gets the Pappy McDowell as his engineer. He's 40-some years old. He's older than the other crew guys, and he's got a bad back. And Jack's got a bad back, but he had their what do you call the life jacket.
Mm-hmm. Mae West.
Mae West, fair enough. And Mae West in his teeth, and drags the guy on his back for 4 hours through Japanese waters to an island. 4 hours of all the guy can remember afterwards is Jack's breathing, because it's all he can hear. And Jack did that. And I think he's unbelievable. I think Jack, and his description in the letter to Inga Binga, his maybe one true girlfriend of his life, is Inga, Danish star that he was married, who was actually married to somebody else at the time. But he writes her about how this woman had, this wife of Pappy McMahon had written him and said how it may just be part of your job, but he was my husband and I couldn't have lived without him. So he writes this letter to his girlfriend. And then he says, but my whole life now has been perfect. It cannot get any better. It can only last a little longer. And the best thing about my life is you, Inga. I'm telling you, this is the best love letter I've ever read. It's like unbelievable. Not only am I a hero, but I love you, Inga. And I think I mentioned Chuck Spaulding said that he was, those two, Inga and Jack, were the closest he'd ever seen of anybody. And now he was a great writer, and he should read the letter. It's in my book, Jack, Elusive Hero.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends. Our guest today, author Chris Matthews. We're discussing his book, Lessons from Bobby, 10 Reasons Robert F. Kennedy Still Matters. Mr. Matthews, is there a particular Hoosier leader and or legend you admire most?
Gene Hackman, come on.
He was born in Illinois.
Hoosiers. I mean, Jane Pauley, come on, she's great. She's still
went to high school right down the street, Warren Central.
It's just she does Sunday morning for CBS. She's great. Let me think. I like Scooter. What's his name? His father was mayor of East St. Louis. Oh no, of East Chicago. Scott Patrick. Scott Patrick's my buddy. Terry Stroud. A buddy of mine from the Carter. Both guys are from the Carter administration. I'm having lunch with them on the 22nd of this month.
That's my birthday, so if I'm
22nd, that's when we have the Metropolitan Club birthday or lunchtime.
Really?
Yeah. That's when you bring your kids and hiding around town to bring them to dinner with you.
The one name that I always get in response to that question, and then I want to go on to Kennedy in Vietnam.
Oh, I forgot the kid from the hick from French Lick. Yeah.
You remember Michael Cooper, the Laker, Los Angeles Laker, who always guarded Bird, and Bird said he was the best defender he ever encountered. Anyway, Cooper just wrote a book, and he's coming on my podcast, and it's funny to listen to read his book, because half of his book is, I hate Larry Bird so much I can't stand it, and the other half is, I respect the living hell out of that man because he was so good, which is sometimes works.
I loved it. Him and the Magic playoffs were unbelievable.
Oh.
Magic.
The name that gets sent to me when I ask that question about who's your leader and legend, the answer 99% of the time is either Mitch Daniels or Richard Lugar.
Lugar was good. He got defeated in the primary, which is what's happening these days in the Republican side.
I worked on that primary as a PR person.
Really?
For Lugar.
Is it Canute? Rockney, or is it Newt Rockney?
It's Canadian.
Pronounce it. Canute. Okay, Canute Rockney. The movie with Pat O'Brien.
Yeah.
I met Pat O'Brien once, years later. We went to my father's Knights of Columbus, hung around with them. He said he could never get a job after World War II. He came back from World War II, and he could never work again. He could never. It wasn't the blacklist. It wasn't anything particularly. He just couldn't work again because he had so many jobs before the war, before World War II. He was a big star.
Yeah, he was. Pat O'Brien, absolutely. He had a co-star that we've all heard of, Mr. Ronald Reagan.
Yeah, I know.
You mentioned a few minutes ago about how Robert Kennedy identified.
He got him in the movie too. Pat O'Brien got Ronald Reagan in that movie. As played the Gipper.
And that pass that when Notre Dame wins the national championship in '88 and they get to go to the White House before Reagan leaves office is one of my favorite clips. Reagan throws the football. He cheers with him. Typical Ronald Reagan Hollywood ending, which, may or may not have driven you nuts.
No, I was against it politically, but I always liked Reagan. I loved him on GE Theater for all those years. I never told Tip that, but I grew up 9:00 Sunday night was right after Ed Sullivan was Ronald Reagan until he got beaten by the cowboy movie. What's it called? Oh God, I can't remember things like the cowboy movie. Yeah, Bonanza.
Oh yeah, that's right. Did Robert Kennedy's views on the Vietnam War, how did they evolve to the point where in the late 60s, before his death, before his candidacy, he's becoming more and more strident in his criticism of Lyndon Johnson and the war?
Well, I think it probably had to do with the manner in which his brother fought the war when he was president, with a light group of soldiers, the war advisors, who he had limited to like 18,000. In 1965, Johnson was confronted by McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, with the idea, we're going to lose South Vietnam unless we put more troops in. They put in 500,000 troops. Now, I had a somewhat left-wing professor at Holy Cross. He's a professor mainly at Tufts University, and he said, of course, if we put 500,000 troops in there, we can survive. But that was considered colossally insane to put 500,000 troops in there. We were losing, 10,000 a week. It was unbelievable. Not 10,000, 10,000 a year, I guess it was. It was cannon fodder. And we weren't getting anywhere. The generals, it turns out, nobody believed in the war. Nixon didn't believe in the war by his time in office. Johnson apparently gave up on the war. He got McNamara a job at the World Bank. Everybody was leaving, but the soldiers were fighting. And look, I go over there every year to teach. I'm going over there next month for another couple weeks, teaching in Vietnam, Fulbright University, Vietnam. And it's in English, and it's very independent. I think I'm very independent. And the city of Hanoi and the city of Ho Chi Minh City, which is really Saigon still, are booming cities, 12 million people in Ho Chi Minh, all high-end stuff in the streets, all the shopping malls, everything looks like capitalism overblown. You can't believe it. What's going on? Did we lose this war? Did we win this war? What happened? And the kids are now third generation from the soldiers. They like us. I'm sorry. They like us. A kid did my last class a couple years ago, brought his guitar into class and sang Strangers in the Night for me. And maybe it's kind of the irony of us being strangers, but our grandparents or me would have been fighting each other and to the death. And by the way, the horror of that war, just think about this. There were no prisoners of war on the ground. The prisoners of war were the flyers that they saved as bargaining chips. What happened in the jungle? We turned over to Arvin and our people, and they killed us. They all butchered every one of us. I mean, every American soldier was killed. Does anybody ever think about that? Where were the POWs from the jungle? They weren't there because they got killed. These guys were mercilessly, horribly killed who got brought down in battle. Putting your hands in the air did nothing.
And did Bobby Kennedy know about this? Did he know that the war can't be won? I don't know. Have you read the new book by the Taubman brothers about McNamara at War?
Yeah, I should probably.
They came on sorry, Mr. Matthews.
Well, I believe
They came on my podcast and they were terrific in how they dissected McNamara's sort of descent. And you mentioned in the summer or spring of 65, they knew. When did Robert Kennedy know, or at least think he knew, the war couldn't be won militarily?
I don't know if I ever isolated that. I know he began to speak up in 66. I don't know. That's a great question. I don't know if there was a turning point, really. I don't think I ever found that in any of my books. It was when did Cronkite know it? Cronkite knew it by the spring of 68 when he said, we're not going to have it anything better than a rough compromise. It wasn't going to be a Pax Americana. We were going to maybe get a raw end of a deal. We were going to get a coalition government that wasn't going to be heading in the right direction. It will probably end up a communist government like Laos or something. And that's not what we're going to do. We did enough. I don't know. That's a great question.
Let me ask a question I was fortunate enough to ask Dwight Chapin and Craig Shirley.
I think Dwight Chapin.
Yeah. What a not.
During Watergate.
Yeah. What a wonderfully nice man. The first sort of political memory I have is Watergate summer. I remember Watergate summer because my mother was such a Nixon hater that we had it on all the time. But wouldn't it have been better, given all that happened in the subsequent 15 years or so, if Nixon had beaten Kennedy in 1960?
Well, I think about that a lot because I know I'm not a Nixon hater per se. I guess I rooted for him to lead by 74. I would have been blowing my horn in front of the White House when you could still drive down. But that said, I do think if I took the progression of Nixon's life from the Checkers speech and the way that the press treated him, and hardly anybody stuck with him when he was pretty innocent. Jerry Ford did, and he remembered that.
That's right.
And even his friends, like the Eisenhower people, turned against him, and he had to go out on television and win the case with the Checkers speech, which was maudlin, to put it lightly. And how people turned against him after losing to Pat Brown in 62 and just wrote him off. And personally, it was a personal thing, the way they rejected him. It was Nixon's the bad guy. And I think he became more and more bitter after 60 and 62. I wrote a book on it about Kennedy and Nixon. And I thought he turned really bitter towards everybody. And Jack did too. Jack ended up turning against Nixon finally in 60. He was always with him.
Yeah.
Like Nixon until Nixon did some cheap shots like having his picture taken with Jack before the debate and putting his finger in the guy's chest, acting like he was bossing him around, like he did with Khrushchev.
Right, he did with Khrushchev. In front of the washing machine.
Well, that stuck. Jack Kennedy was an aristocrat in many ways, as below the belt. You don't take advantage of your personal relationship to do harm to your opponent. You don't do that. He also didn't like Nixon didn't give a concession speech on television, and I agree with him on that. I think that's a big part of my thoughts right now. You must give a concession speech on television so that your supporters get the word from you as to who won. It's the most important message of your career. You have to tell them, if you're the loser of a campaign, that the other guy won, or the person won. You have to do it because nobody else has the authority or the credentials to do it.
Do you think in 2000, Al Gore's concession speech was the high point of his entire political career?
It was written by Richard Goodwin for one reason.
Well, that helps. I'm trying to get Mrs. Doris Kearns Goodwood. I have begged her to come on the podcast because I've read so many books by her and have had her mentioned so many times. But Goodwin wrote that speech. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
That's brilliant.
He wrote the Bobby Kennedy speech in South Africa too. The Ripples of Hope speech he gave at Cape Town University.
Some people just have it.
He gave the Ed Muskie speech in 1970 that Muskie gave against Nixon. And he gave he also wrote the We Shall Overcome speech by Lyndon Johnson for the Voting Rights Act in 64, 65. All those speeches, Richard Goodwin.
If Nixon wins in 60 and Kennedy doesn't?
I think if Nixon had won, he would have been less bitter. He might have been more of an Eisenhower kind of personality. He broke bad. He just did. All those defeats turned him into a guy who will do anything. And the cheap shots of going after, first of all, a lot of this is Kissinger's fault. First of all, the whole thing about the plumbers and all, that was Kissinger.
Watergate is all Kissinger's fault.
I just think Kissinger got off so easily with the celebrity press he gets. And he was the one that said, even though the Pentagon Papers attacked Johnson and Kennedy's handling of the war, didn't touch Nixon's. Nixon didn't hear about them. Henry went crazy. So we got to start a plumbers group because he wanted to protect his project with China. But Nixon should have never been in that fight. I don't know. And also, I have another theory. H.R. Haldeman was an anti-Semite. I'm sorry, that's what he was. And every time he's in the room, Nixon's at his worst on that subject. He just rose or descended to the level of H.R. Haldeman.
And the tapes prove that.
Oh, and June 23rd tape, when going after saying the CIA should cover up for what would happen with Watergate. And I got to tell you, I still don't understand what Nixon said. We got to get him on the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs. What I thought he was up to was Nixon thought that the CIA and all the Ivy Leaguers, that the CIA and the FBI were all protecting Kennedy and not delivering the second strike to protect the Bay of Pigs fighters. But I think it is that. I think it's pretty simple. Nixon thought that the Ivy League elite were protecting Kennedy, so he was going to get behind the same shield.
What do you think of the movie Nixon?
I didn't like it. I thought it was unrelieved negative. And I don't think any story can be that unpleasant. It was Richard III. It was awful. And I really, because I just read Anthony Hopkins' memoir, which was fabulous, but he doesn't know American history.
No.
He doesn't know it. And Nixon was not the simple, and I don't think he was this simplistic, awful person all the time. I mean, if you accept that, you cannot accept it and say they were sitting around with a Haldeman and Ehrlichman, yeah. But he did try to he tried to break up the Cold War with China.
I've been fortunate enough to know and be good friends with several Democrats here in Indianapolis who were at the Chicago convention. Ed Tracy, Jerry Zorri, Jim Voiles, to name a few. They are all convinced if Kennedy had been there, as you said a few minutes ago, it would have been completely different. So my question to you as a historian and a Politico, what would have happened in 68, Robert Kennedy goes there?
What they said, it would have been an historically positive event of Bobby Kennedy looking like $1 million, like he did, walking into that room, taking on Humphrey. You got probably going delegation to delegation, squeaking out the votes, because that's what he'd have to do. The votes weren't there. He had to turn them around. He had to get people to change their minds, including Dick Daley and all the big bosses of the cities. You'd have to get all the Irish guys to change minds. He'd have to win New York the following week, which was not easy. He'd have to just keep that excitement of midnight in Los Angeles going, keep the excitement going. And he'd have to get McCarthy out of the race because McCarthy was a distraction. It was never going to be the nominee. Right. And McCarthy had gotten into a weird mode by then. He was so angry about Bobby in that debate last weekend. He said, Bobby accused me of the following three things. He accused me of wanting to move African Americans into Orange County. Then it was a twisted thing, but it's something like Bobby didn't like ghettos, so he's going to mix them up and everything. And then he was going to hit me for not being pro-Israel enough, and that's probably what happened with Sirhan. Sirhan, he said that I wasn't giving enough aid to Israel when in fact we were delivering arms just like he was, but under the table. And also he accused me of negotiating with the enemy. He said, who else you got to negotiate with? All right, I'm negotiating with the VC and with the North Vietnamese. Who else do you negotiate with? Of course I had to negotiate with the enemy. but he felt that all those were cheap shots by Kennedy. But then again, look how blasé he was after that debate. He just didn't act like he was in it, actually trying to win. He's trying to win it without any effort.
So in the movie Nixon, Oliver Stone has Anthony Hopkins saying as Nixon, he's going to ride his brother's corpse right into the White House. Was that the fear among Republicans, that if Kennedy emerges from the Chicago convention or from the primary system as the Democratic nominee in 68, that it was over again for Nixon? They thought they could beat Humphrey, but not Kennedy?
I think Nixon was shook. I read about and written about this in Kennedy and Nixon. Some of his party were shook by it. I mean, it was Julie Nixon, some others. They're very clearly shook by the entry of Bobby Kennedy into that race. It disturbed them. They thought it was all going to happen again. But some others were tougher about it. I think probably Haldeman and the others. I think they figured they had a different group of people, a tougher group, a hard-mold group of people than Nixon had the first time. Nixon was going to play tougher. I don't know. I don't really know. I don't write projected history. I give you the past.
Well, I will say this.
I don't know what, and I do think he had carried South Dakota, California. He had lost to Oregon. He had won Nebraska and Indiana. But those are relatively small stakes to go into and Johnson was still president, and Johnson was still working behind the scenes, probably ironically for Humphrey, who he didn't really like that much. But he might have been working at the convention. I remember that 68 convention. I loved it. I watched on television every minute as in grad school and a student. I just watched it. I sat there with Coca-Cola and what's it, roast beef sandwiches coming in from somewhere and red wine. I didn't leave. I remember Cronkite once said, "It's late. Get some sleep, and I'll see you in the morning." It was like he was welcoming into the camper. And his endless coverage of the convention in 68. I love it.
You said you write about the past. Obviously, I will say that the first book I ever bought of yours is the Kennedy and Nixon book, The Rivalry That Shaped Post-War America. If you love American history, American political history, I'm telling you, to the listeners of the podcast, buy that book. It's very even. It's wonderfully written. Nixon doesn't, as Mr. Matthews has said during the podcast, doesn't come off. I mean, he breaks down in tears at one point at Jack Kennedy's bedside or in the hospital, if I recall.
Well,
Let me ask you a couple of questions about Robert Kennedy, and then we'll end the podcast. We'll be mindful of your time. What would Robert Francis Kennedy think of our politics today?
Well, I think he would have recognized that Trump is a liar, that Trump did not concede defeat in 2020. Apparently, he asked, according to Fortune magazine, I went over it last night, told everybody who wanted a job in this new term, second term, had to basically take an oath saying that he won that 2020 election. In other words, he's won 3 straight elections and talks now of running a fourth against the Constitution. Apparently, that's one reason why you can't really trust Hegseth or any of these people, because they've already sworn to the lie that Trump used to create the mob that went up to Capitol Hill on January 6th, 2021. It's a horrendous breach of our Constitution. Every president running for office must swear to themselves before they even run that if I lose this election, I will say so on television, because I will not let my people become like third world types and be running around saying we were screwed. They lied. They cheated like some crazy developing economy or developing democracy. Like every time they lose in these countries, they claim it was stolen from them. And every time they win, they start arresting people. This is Trump. You arrest people. You go after Jim Comey. You go after Letitia Brown, Letitia James. You act just like a triumphant third world country. Well, democracy is a joke. And anyway, that's what I think. And I think Bobby Kennedy gave a speech in Oregon a week before he was killed. That Pat Buchanan, who was visiting it, the conservative Pat Buchanan, said it was the most marvelous speech in the world. It was better than if Bobby had won that primary. He gave a better speech in defeat, and he gave all the credit to G. McCarthy. So that's quite a tribute from the other side. And I think that's about the best I could say. When I was a kid in high school, I watched Averell Harriman concede defeat in the New York governor's race to Nelson Rockefeller. And here's this old money, big money guy, inherited wealth. And my dad is very middle class, a regular guy, and he was taken with it. And I'm sitting with him watching this in our basement rec room. And I was thinking, this is what it is to be a man or a woman and accept defeat. And tell your people, you lost. I'm sorry, I didn't get enough votes. I wish I could have done better. That's the American democracy at work. The loser gives the verdict to the country. So there's no doubt about the election. It's over. All the balloon popping and all the TV ads and all the BS and all the PR, all irrelevant. What matters is the voters had their say and they picked the other guy. And that is the heart of American democracy. And I think that the one who can deliver that verdict better than anyone else is John McCain or John Kerry or Dick Nixon or Hillary Clinton. You got to tell the people who won. And that's the job of the loser. It's the beauty of him. And nobody did it better than Adlai Stevenson when he lost an impossible race against Eisenhower in 52. That's what he did. And Trump can't do it. He can't bring himself to a grown-up's job, which is to admit defeat.
You must have had a pretty decent, or at least a professional working relationship with Ted Kennedy. I just recorded a podcast with John A. Farrell about his brilliant book, Ted Kennedy, A Life. Did you ever get a chance to talk about Bobby Kennedy with Tip O'Neill?
You know, my limited relations with Teddy is I was in a race up with him on Nantucket, boat racing. And I had him to dinner at our house with John Edwards, Glenn Close, the actor. And we had fun. I mean, I knew he had a bad back. I could tell he sat on the armchair. He didn't really sit in the chair. He gave a nice little talk. He joked about how it's amazing that people can just walk in the room and stand up and do a toast. He said, I can't do that. He was humble. I used to watch him in action when I worked with Tip all those years, but not close up. I think he went to Tip a lot for moral support. I think having Tip around, he knew made him look good. Just joining up with Tip, because Tip was a profoundly big-time politician, very big. And I don't know everything about him. If I ever figure all about everything there is about him, I might write a book about him, but I haven't figured him out yet.
Do you still believe all politics is local in the age of social media?
I never believed that. I mean, Chip, I made him do that because he would say things like that about there's always some local reason why something moved a certain way. But I think our politics today is very national. The voter opinion that you get about Trump in rural Pennsylvania is not much different than the one you hear in the South. There's the anti-opposition, anti-establishment thinking and the pro-establishment thinking. There's the college crowd and the town crowd, the town and the gown crowd. That's one thing that's new in politics, just like in Breaking Away, as you know. These are the cutters, and the cutters are up against the college kids. And which is, by the way, a great movie. And it's a terrible direction American politics is taking. The Democrats have been identified with the college crowd. They should not be. They should be identifying with the other crowd who are both. And it's an elitist mentality, which I just detest. I detest deplorables, all that stuff. I hate it. It's wrong. It should have never been used, ever. And I think it's in the minds of some people that shouldn't be in their minds, but it is in their minds. They had too much superior Ivy League education that somehow they get through it. And after all that education, and even the toughest of them all, Yale Law, they think they're better than anybody else, and they're not. They're more educated than anybody else. There's a difference.
I hope my friend Toby McClamrock heard that. All politics is national, not local per se. We've reached one quick question. John F. Kennedy runs for the presidency, wins. Robert F. Kennedy runs for the presidency and is assassinated. Edward Moore Kennedy runs for the presidency in 1980 and loses. One of my favorite political books ever is Camelot's End, the book by, I think, John Ward, detailing that primary. Just for a minute or so, how much did Robert F. Kennedy's race and his drive to be president influence Teddy Kennedy's decision to run against a sitting president?
A great question, because they both did. And all I can tell you is that Teddy Kennedy opposed Bobby running in 68.
Yeah.
Sorensen also opposed it. All the other young anti-war guys wanted him to run. Jack Newfield, for example, wanted him to run. Said if he didn't run, he would lose the best part of his soul. If he didn't run in 68, if he waited to 72. I think Ted Kennedy suffered from believing in polls. He believed that the polls that showed him ahead in 79 were indicative of how it was going to turn out. The invasion of Afghanistan and the taking of our prisoners in Iraq led quickly to Carter being the front runner. Carter won the Iowa caucuses by 2.5 to 1, blew Kennedy right out of the saddle. Kennedy was already in retreat from the beginning. He lost New Hampshire. It was an incredible set of defeats. I'm sorry, Bob Shrum was wrong. Whoever in Kennedy's ear was not feeding him the actual truth. It wasn't happening. He wasn't winning. And when he gave the Georgetown speech, that was the speech of a loser. He gave the speech about why he should have run, but it's exactly what he ran on. I'm sorry. I was Jimmy Carter's speechwriter. I was with Carter. And there's so many families, including the O'Neill family, that were split down the middle. And we were the Democratic incumbent. There was a real difference, just like there was between Bobby and LBJ. There was a real difference of personality and background between Teddy Kennedy and Jimmy Carter. They were different people. And Jimmy Carter was you might say a little goody two-shoes about booze and things like that, women and all. And he obviously had a different view on that than Kennedy. But Kennedy's attitude about Carter was that he wasn't for health care for everybody. Well, so find another politician who's running for president who's giving health care for everybody. It had to be paid for, as we're learning right now from the Affordable Care Act. Somebody has to pay for it somewhere, or you just borrow the money from China. And you can't just keep saying, well, we have to have it. How are you going to pay for it? They have to come up with something. And Europeans have their way of doing it. They tax everybody. And, Americans are not ready for more taxation. I don't think that's going to happen. So anyway, I was for Jimmy Carter.
As we end the podcast with the same 5 questions of all of our guests, and one of the podcast guests who has answered these questions is David Rubenstein, who I didn't know who
You can afford to.
he can afford to. And I'll confess, as I have on other podcasts, I had no idea who he was. His publicist reached out to me.
We were on the plane together, heading out a night before the election in 1980.
That's right.
And we're on the Air Force One, and we're heading out across the country. We stopped in somewhere like in Michigan for the evening news, because you always time these to the evening news to get the most audience. And it may have been East St. Louis or someplace like that in Missouri. Anyway, so we're in Illinois. So we're flying out west, and we're going over state after state after state, all the way from the Midwest, all the way to Portland. So some young staffers said, how come we're not stopping anywhere? Why aren't we landing the plane somewhere so we can get some votes? And David he just says, because there's not a state we're going over that we have a chance in the world of getting. And that was JFJ. He just had a big book party, and his girlfriend had a big party for me in New York on this book.
Oh, David Rubenstein did?
Yeah. So what are your 5 questions?
I didn't know who he was. The publicist sent me the book. I read it.
Billionaire. There's not that many billionaires, but he's
Yeah, well, and I even confessed to him on the podcast. I said, finally, after reading your book, which I loved, I thought, well, let me find out a little bit more about this guy. And the first line I read was, the owner of the Baltimore Orioles.
Oh.
And then I found out, obviously, he worked for President Carter in the White House. First question, what was your first job?
Paper. The Philadelphia Bulletin. I carried over 100 papers. So it broke the limit. You're most shouldn't have over 100, but I had more than 100. I had my brothers helping me. It was an afternoon newspaper, big fat newspaper, especially on Tuesday, because the big shopping day was Wednesday in Philly, and all the department stores. That's when people used to still go into town to shop. And I didn't make a lot of money, but it was, I did it every day, no matter what the weather. I delivered those newspapers.
What was your first concert?
It was probably at St. Christopher's School. I was taking piano, and we had recitals every year.
What about the first concert you paid for? Blood, Sweat, and Tears, Mamas and the Papas? Mhm.
I've never been a concert goer. I can't think of. No, I wouldn't be your best bet on that.
Not even like National Lampoon, Animal House, mentioned civil rights, modern art, folk
Love-
music.
I love the movie. Let's see. Concert. I went to the March on the Pentagon. That's the closest thing.
And the cover of the new biography of McNamara that I just had on the podcast, the picture on the cover is Robert McNamara looking out his office at the 67 March. He's probably trying to find you by the Taubman brothers.
And I thought it was frightening because I understood the power of mob violence, and you get into a certain spirit, and you get excited by the mob, and it's frightening up at and they brought out a bunch of enlisted men marching unit, and they started to push the crowd around and shove it around in directions by just the way they marched. And I was very angry about that. And I said, this is what a mob is like. You don't want to get in a mob.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Hardball. Yeah, I'm telling you.
You went on Crossfire to promote that book, and Pat Buchanan, who I just love, he says, "Isn't the subtitle of your book by someone who knows the game or something, knows how to play the game?" And Pat Buchanan looked at you, goes, "Real touch of modesty, Chris." I remember that like it was yesterday.
That was written by my publisher, so I didn't write that. But I did put the word hardball. I wanted to be hardball, and the book's really good because it talks to you about how to be a politician, how to treat people, and get people to do favors for you. One of those little things that is so unchristian, but if you want to get into politics, what you want to do is go around and get in the habit of getting people to do things for you. Because once somebody's done something for you, for example, if you ask the Kennedy people, why are you a Kennedy person? Because I work for them out in Indiana. You understand? That's how you get to be. You don't get it because the Kennedys did you a favor, because you did something for the Kennedys. This is what the Kennedy thing is. When people would walk into their offices, their storefront offices, they would say, sorry, I want you to answer some mail here from people. I want you to thank them for coming by the office. So you're writing letters on behalf of the family, of course. And immediately you're part of the team. And it's how things work in a very odd way. You become loyal to someone based on your expressed loyalty to them. And that's how it works.
And the greatest example of that, maybe not the greatest, my favorite, is the pass that Birch Bayh was given in the 1980 primaries by the Kennedys because Birch Bayh had pulled Ted Kennedy out of a burning, crashed airplane. And they said, leave Birch alone. He's done enough. If you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
To be in the outer cabinet when Churchill called for war. When he told them, we've got to go to war. And we can't buckle to Hitler. And we can't follow the ways of the British establishment anymore. It's over. And if we fail to fight the Nazis, we will be thrown out of office. And he was right.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, this is
Churchill, it's to Churchill, without a doubt.
Living today.
Oh, living today. Well, that's a great question. Probably Barack Obama. Why have you left us?
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise. We are also a federally certified, veteran-owned small business. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. But for this one, I'm going to add the legacy, brilliance, and generosity of Dr. James Riggs, who loved Robert Kennedy so much, he named his son Jason Robert Francis Kennedy Riggs. Our guest today, Chris Matthews, author of Lessons from Bobby, 10 Reasons Robert F. Kennedy Still Matters. Mr. Matthews, I can't thank you enough for your time. I've watched you on screen. I miss hardball. I've been a Republican all my life, thanks to Nixon and Reagan. But my admiration for your style and your honesty, not only in this book, but in your commentary, is undiminished. Thank you.
So much, Robert. Thank you. So you know when it ended. You know when it ended it, didn't you? You know when the ending was. Where have you been? Why don't you come back? Come back, Shane. Why have you left us? What's he doing? He lives in town a few blocks from here, and he doesn't show up. It's unbelievable.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.